Welcome to Cardium from RES Medical, the podcast that gets to the heart of travel healthcare and asks, what's your why? With each episode, we explore the topics and issues that impact healthcare professionals in the fields of nursing and allied health. Now, here are your hosts, Sunny and Matt.
Welcome to another episode of Cardium. Welcome back to our subscribers. If you're a new listener to Cardium, welcome to you too, and please subscribe so you can be notified and tune in for future episodes. Join me as always, Sunny. How are you today?
I am great. How are you?
I'm doing really, really well. I say this about every single episode, but this episode is going to be awesome.
That's because every episode we have is amazing.
Is awesome. Well, you know this about me, but I nerd. I'm a nerd.
You are,
and I nerd out
in
on
a great
things.
way, though.
And one of the secrets about one of my nerdisms is I love the television shows about tiny houses.
I do too.
Love it. So when this was brought to us, this guest was brought to us today, I could not be more stoked. I mean, we've spoke about a lot of good things,
yes,
but this is really cool. So I think our guest is going to give us a lot of insight about some tiny house stuff.
I know, and I'm really, really excited because I think a lot of our listeners are going to be excited and they're going to be pretty stoked to hear how this all came about. So without any further ado, Dr. Liam Caven is a DPT, has been a travel physical therapist for the last 2 years since graduating from Ithaca College in 2017. Originally from Maine, he's worked in major hospitals in Boston, New York City, Southern Massachusetts, and is now in his 5th contract in the Four Corners areas of New Mexico with RES Medical. Liam travels with his girlfriend, Gabby, and most of the time they live in their fully rebuilt 1984 truck camper. Once their time in New Mexico is up, they plan to travel up the West Coast. You can follow their journey on Instagram at Timmy and the Ugly Camper. which is your tiny house, really?
What's that?
Which is kind of like this is your tiny house, right?
No, exactly. Yeah.
And I want to make sure I get that right. It's at Timmy and the Ugly Camper. That's an interesting name.
Well, so we decided that when we rebuilt it, like we made the interior look really nice, but then the outside was pretty ugly. So we were like, let's just embrace it.
I love it.
That's awesome. So let's start with you, Liam. Tell me a little bit about what led you into being a physical therapist. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So I think lots of people have really great stories about how they became a PT with like either they tore an ACL and they went through like the rehab process or something like that. And for me, I didn't have any like specific injury or anything like that. For me, I was just really interested in kind of the physics of physical therapy and kind of the health related aspects of it where you treat people specifically through exercise alone and you don't get kind of all screwed up by the getting into medications and more of the politics of medical care and things like that. And I enjoyed kind of the direct patient interaction that I saw in like the PT clinic in my town. And so it kind of drove me towards that. And it didn't hurt that it was like a 6-year doctoral degree. I thought that was really cool at the time. And I know that's what is attracting a lot of people to the field now. And yeah, that was kind of my big reason for going in, I suppose. Not as major an event story as a lot of people have, but just kind of what worked out for me.
That's awesome. And it doesn't really matter because it's what drove you to your passion. So that's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, those are all fantastic, Liam, but let's cut to the chase here because I'm nerding out. I need to know.
Hey, this is the interesting part.
Yeah, let's hear about this tiny house. Why a tiny house? Why Timmy? What led you to Timmy here?
Ever since like sophomore year of college, like I think it was actually right before like the show started, but it was becoming a big thing to like people were like tiny houses, like it's a craze, it's really cool. And I was like, oh, like I'm definitely gonna do that. Like after college, I'll get a tiny house, like I do the whole trailer and like build it up and everything and drop the like $30,000 or whatever people did to get those. And it kind of evolved over time. Like right after college, I still had the interest, but I was working in Boston for a few months, and you can't really live in a tiny house in Boston. It's like too metropolitan pretty much. And so like once the idea finally started to come around where I was like, all right, I'm probably going to be leaving the city soon. Like what are the options out there? Van life became a really big thing. And so we looked at vans originally, and I had a 1987 Volkswagen van again. that I lived in for 3 or 4 months. And we kind of like rebuilt that a little bit on the inside. And then we went through more of my ideas. We were like, how do we kind of grow this to live with 2 people as Gabby kind of became more of the picture? Decided the Vanagon was way too small. And we're like, all right, we can do like a large van, which we build out, which people spend tons of money on, or we can just came around to the truck camper idea. Like we can get this reliable vehicle and then have like this modular camper that comes off that we can drop places and just have a daily commuter. And yeah, it kind of grew into that. So we built a truck camper instead.
Nice.
So when you're talking, graduating from van life to Timmy, so it was a size issue at that point for you guys, enable you to travel across the country, be comfortable, still be able to go where you want to go and have accessibility and everything. So really the upgrade for you, if you can call it that, from a mini house to a tiny house, was really about size from the van?
Yeah, partially. I mean, there were a lot of parts that went into it. Like the Vanagon, it's an 87. They don't make anything like that anymore. So you can't get a van with the pop-ups and everything like that anymore for anything less than like 60 grand. And so we were like, we don't really want to spend like 60 grand on this new build. Like, that's just for the vehicle alone, and then you still have to put all the stuff inside of it.
Yeah.
And so like we could have gotten like a lot of people do the big old Sprinter vans. I'm sure if anybody does a contract out west, like they'll see them everywhere. But they're a lot of money. Whereas you can do a truck camper and spend way less. Like we got the new vehicle and then spend almost nothing on the truck camper itself, and then just the time to rebuild it. And we still get about as much space as you get in like one of those big full-size Sprinter vans. But we don't have the debt that might be associated with one of those things, which is a big thing for us.
Yeah, that's something to consider for sure, is the cost.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like it's a cheap date. Obviously, to have that freedom and the portability comes at a price a little bit, but it sounds like you guys really knew what you needed, especially as it evolved a little bit.
Is that why you didn't go with an RV then?
Yeah, so the big thing with RVs is if you buy a new one, they tend to not be the best build quality, period. At least the current RVs, unless you want to spend a lot of money on like an Airstream or something like that. But those are $120,000, so that's not worth it.
Yeah.
If you buy a used one, then you run into the problem of, all right, if you're a travel physical therapist, how are you going to feel driving through the deserts of Utah, and if you get like a flat tire or your transmission hoops out or something like that. So we were like, we want a new vehicle for the reliability, but how do we make that work with like kind of trying to save money at the same time? So the truck camper happened.
So tell me how so you're in school, you are, trying to get your doctorate's degree. Mm-hmm. But you also have this end goal here of, you're going to be, or did you know you're going to be a travel physical therapist at the time? And then also have this idea of having a tiny house. I mean, tell me, how did those two ideas merge?
It kind of happened like really organically, honestly. I didn't know until probably halfway through my final year that I was like, all right, like I'll do travel, but I wanted to do like a permanent contract first. And so I knew not a permanent contract, a permanent position for a year first.
Sure.
And so I was like, all right, I'll spend a year in Boston and like live the city experience while you're young, and like, it's more fun to be in the city when you're young and like don't have like roots and things like that. And I knew kind of the plan for like a van life or some kind of camper or whatever tiny house would happen after that. But I didn't think of it so much in the terms of like, oh, if you're a travel physical therapist, like it's kind of a match made in heaven to have some sort of mobile housing situation as well. And it just kind of worked out to be like, you know what, like if we're going to move contract to contract, you might as well have this housing setup that just kind of comes with you. You don't have to unload, you don't have to pack up anything. Like you're always ready to be mobile. And so once I got the Vanagon and then started traveling with that, I was like, oh, this is like a super no-brainer. Like it started out as like, this is really a fun thing. And then I was like, this makes a lot of sense for travel physical therapy. So we've just stuck with it.
Okay.
So I think when we're talking, Liam, about, since we are on a podcast, we can't show pictures here. I think it'd be fun for our audience to kind of get a visual of what your setup is like. So you've got a camper that sits on essentially on a pickup truck. Is that kind of where we're going? Can you kind of describe for the audience of how it looks, if they could put it in their mind's eye?
Yeah, so basically, if you go with the general route, a lot of people do like a Ford F-150 or F-250 or something in that size, and then you have like a 7 or an 8 foot bed, and it's just a self-contained truck. And then on top of that, you can get any camper that fits that size truck bed, and then it's pretty much, it's up on jack stands, it's up in the air, and you just back the truck up underneath it and then drop the camper down on top of it and then strap it in. And then the strapping it in part is kind of what holds the two together as you're driving down the road at 70 miles an hour and things like that, or going over washboard or back roads or whatever. So you hope you do a good job strapping it down. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And then our current one, that's the way it connects, but we have a smaller truck. We have a Ford Ranger, mid-size, because we want it to be a little bit more self-contained. And the truck camper itself is lighter, so it pops up and saves a little bit of space that way. And your living space is all self-contained in the camper.
Nice. So this setup, so the larger pickup, you essentially then have two going on, as what you're saying. For the Ranger's got its own setup, and then compared to your other camper setup, is that what you're saying?
Oh, no. We only have the one truck.
Do you? Okay.
Yeah, so it's a lot of people will go like the 250 route, like the bigger trucks. That's what you'll see most commonly. And it's definitely, if you're just brand new to it and don't want to do as much of the tinkering, it's the easier way to do it. Is get a giant truck and just put a regular camper on it. Okay. But we got an undersized truck and then modify the truck to fit a slightly larger camper.
Got it. And then do you take the camper off when you get to your assignment so you can drive your pickup around, or do you keep it all hooked up?
Well, so that's the beauty of it, is we can kind of do whatever we want. So like when we first got here, it wasn't too cold or anything like that. So for the most part, we just left the camper on the truck. We drove it to wherever we wanted to stay for the night, and we on BLM land, and we just kind of popped it up, and we were just in the truck, and the truck was part of it. But we have the option of, if we're on contract, we can drop the camper off and then just use the truck as a commuter. So that's actually what we're doing right now, but it just kind of depends on what we feel like doing that given week or day or whatever.
Sure, yeah, versatile for sure.
Tell me what's the inside of your camper, because when I think of a tiny house, I'm wondering, you know what the house version of a tiny house is on the TV show, but obviously it's going to be different for a travel healthcare worker, because it's not so permanent. You got to be able to go, every 13 weeks, right? So for you, I'm thinking, what's a kitchen look like? What's a bathroom look like? Things like, what's your sleeping area look like? Can you kind of tell me what are those basic essentials look like for you?
Okay. We'll start at the sleeping area, because that's like the very front of it. So the camper is called a cab over. So there's a section that goes over the top of the truck, like over your heads when you're driving, basically. Okay. And I think we have a full-size bed up there right now. Okay. It's like a ton of space. So you kind of sleep like way up in the air, away from the bears or anything that you may be concerned about.
That's a good thing.
And then like right below that, kind of like over the sides of the truck bed, is where like your kitchen's going to be. We have it down on, like, if you're walking in, our entire kitchen is on the left side, and like we have a bunch of drawers we put in and a sink, and we have like we live in the lap of luxury, so we have running water, of course. And then down the right side is like, it's just a couch area, and then we have our fridge over there. It's like an Overlander fridge. It takes very low voltage, and then kind of everything's kind of just tucked away into shelving units and everything as much as possible, kind of beneath the seating, around the seating, cabinetry in the front, cabinetry down the side. Yeah, I mean, it's not a lot of space. That's pretty much it.
What do you cook with? I mean, do you use like a hot burner stove or a microwave, or?
Oh God, no! A microwave would be so much energy.
Oh, okay.
Things you think about at a tiny house that you don't think about otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
School me. Let me know.
we started with, what was it called? I think a new wave electric cook burner, like a propane single burner thing we screw into the top of one of those green canister stoves you usually see people camping with.
Yeah.
And we just use that because it does the trick. It's just like a regular gas stove.
Okay, great.
But there's a lot of options. So
okay.
So I'm really curious when you were talking about you can camp on BLM land if you feel like it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're on an assignment, and you've done 5 assignments now, Liam, what's the typical setup for if you're going to be at a hospital or a location for 13 weeks? Where do you guys park? And is it like a park place? Is there where do people go that they need to have access to? Because you probably don't want to be moving that thing every night, even though you could.
Try not to.
Yeah, but as far as you got to go back to work the next day, what's the easiest, and how do you guys arrange for that?
So that's the big scary question that got me first. Like starting with the van, I was like, oh my god, like where do I like actually put this thing and live? Because you don't ever think about that in terms of like, if I don't have like an actual address, like where do I go? And I'll admit it was like a really big challenge for the first like 2 weeks or so. On the East Coast, I was in Attleboro, Massachusetts, which is when I first started living in the van. And this is like the part that sketches people out, I think, a little bit. So I just started first, like I was on the side of the road, like in just parts of town that looked like they were peaceful. And like you kind of the thing,
this looks less shady.
It's a weird thing, right?
Yeah, that wouldn't be weird at all, seeing a van just randomly parked in peaceful places. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
And on the East Coast, like that's a big challenge, and it's not like that's not glamorous. That's kind of one of the parts that you don't see in all like the van life Instagrams and stuff like that.
Right.
But for me, it worked because at that point it was just me, and I was like, I spend most of my day at work, and then every single night I come back and I just I go to the gym, I make my dinner, and then I go and I find a spot to park at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Like it's just a place to sleep. You don't.
Right.
A quote that I hear all the time that I really like is you don't live in the van, you live out of the van. So like.
Yeah.
All my life was happening elsewhere, and then I just happened to, instead of going to a nice warm apartment at night, I was in my very stuffy at that point van instead.
Yeah.
But I parked on the side of the road for a while. I parked in like the back area of the hospital for like a little while, but I rotated around, so I was never in one spot every single night, which is taxing. Like it's not an easy thing to do, I'll admit. But what eventually ended up happening, and what I kind of shoot for now if I'm going to be on the East Coast, is one of my coworkers was like, like I have this big empty lawn, like you can just park in my lawn. And so another objectively weird thing, but I just went and I just parked in my coworker's lawn, and that's where I lived for the last 2 months.
Nice. I thought you were going to say, when you said this is going to sound weird, but I always wonder, like when I drive by storage unit places and you see RVs in there, I'm like, is he going to say that he like stays in the storage unit parking lot?
Come on, I have standards.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Caven.
It was once I got used to it, it was way easier than I initially thought on the East Coast. I will say it's much more of a match made in heaven on the West Coast. Like out here, it's easy, like objectively easy, because there's BLM everywhere. There's tons and tons of open land. Like you can drive into anywhere pretty much and just set up, and there's probably going to be 3 other people doing the same thing.
That's awesome.
A few hundred feet away. And if you want to be more isolated, like you can drive out 3 miles into the woods, especially with a truck having 4-wheel drive, and we can go and park out there. And we have the world's our oyster out here pretty much, whereas it was much more of a challenge on the East Coast.
That's awesome.
That makes sense. So I'm curious, if you were to talk to someone that was a traveling healthcare professional, and they wanted to get into this, what are the big benefits to this? Obviously, I think you mentioned one, you live your life outside of your home. I think that's probably, you probably do a little bit more living outside when you're not working. What are some of the other big benefits to this?
I think the absolute biggest thing that's the big benefit for travelers, specifically travel nurses, travel physical therapists, OTs, whatever, is kind of that mobility aspect. It takes the guesswork out of where am I going to live, how am I going to find housing, how much am I going to pay for short-term furnished housing, and is that even going to be an option for that first week that I'm out there? That's I think the biggest challenge we face as travelers is like we don't want to get stuck in some dingy motel for like a few weeks and then find like a not so great apartment in the wrong part of town or something like that because you don't know the area. Whereas if you have your house on in your truck bed basically, or in your van, or as part of your camper or whatever, you can go out, you spend that first week kind of just exploring the area, camping in the places that seem right, especially if you're out west on the BLM, and then you can kind of just settle down wherever you like, and if you get bored you just switch it up and you go live somewhere else, or that might be 3 miles from work and you can still commute from, but it's a beautiful natural area that you're living in.
That's great.
What would you say would be a disadvantage or some of the disadvantages?
There definitely are a few. So we're smaller than most people are, especially for two people. A lot of people I think who do this working full time specifically, like not remotely, usually have a much bigger setup than we do. And so like our biggest thing I think we're struggling with like right now is we're out in Colorado. Like, so I work in New Mexico, but I'm living in southwestern Colorado, and skiing's a big thing here. We want to get like a lot more winter gear, and we decided we're like, well, maybe we'll rent for now because we don't know where we're going to put like a lot of winter gear.
Yeah.
If we start to acquire like tons of boots and things like that, we want to make sure we have a place to put it. And so that's a bit of a challenge. It's also an advantage because we don't have as much stuff like just in our lives that's kind of weighing us down, and it does make you more intentional about the things you own and the things you buy. But it's definitely, sometimes you're like, oh, I wish I could just like go and buy a pair of skis and not worry about like, well, where am I going to put that pair of skis in January or in June,
Yeah.
And then I think, let's see, the other disadvantage of it specifically, I really think that's the biggest one. And then on the East Coast, it was like, yeah, where do I park this thing without being the creeper in the van?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Of all the things you think about on an assignment, you're going to a new place. You've got patients that you have to care for. None of that was a concern for you, Liam. It was where am I going to park my creepy van? I mean, that's a different take for the traveling world about where am I going to live tonight. So different world. You definitely have some different concerns there. I'm curious because the traveling healthcare professionals do receive stipends. What as far as the stipends that you receive, how they work, is there anything different that a traveler would get that is living the van life or living the tiny house life versus somebody who's going, trying to find a traditional apartment for their assignments?
So you still have to follow the regular rules of like, I have a tax home, which is back in Maine, and this sounds very familiar to anyone who's traveling on a regular basis, is you have to maintain your tax home, and then you have to have your second location that you're living to like qualify for that tax home, basically. That's kind of why you get the tax benefits. Within my understanding, the way it works is as long as you have that permanent address and you're not working near that permanent address, you, no matter what, you get your stipend, you get your food, housing, et cetera, right? And so that's kind of like, that's ours to keep, like that's our incentive to be travelers effectively. The benefit of being kind of this mobile housing setup is you can keep that in pocket much more of it because you do still have your secondary living expenses, which is your gasoline, and maybe you have an auto payment or however you've decided to do this, but you're not paying to sign up for a 3-month lease that you might end up having to drop if your contract decides they wanted a permanent hire or something like that. So you get all the benefits of that stipend without some of the risk that's associated with it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think traveling healthcare folks out there will know exactly what you're talking about when it comes to those stipends. But it's regardless of not being in an apartment, you still have expenses with your home. I mean, it's just different expenses, and I think that's the big thing. It's not a matter of you just being able to pocket everything. There's just other expenses out there that you have to deal with that not everybody else has to deal with. So without a doubt, I think that's understandable.
Mm-hmm.
So tiny house living is a little bit different when you're living with another person, because I mean, we all have, when we're living with another person in a regular size home, tell us a little bit about what the challenges are with living with another person in a tinier setting?
First of all, I'll admit we might be a little bit of a special case because we tend to just be very close human beings, period, I think.
Oh.
I think working in healthcare, you just you get comfortable with other people in your space, period. So we don't have some of the issues we would have expected initially, like living in such a small space. We don't tend to get upset with each other very easily or anything like that. But I think it also comes back to the fact that while we do sleep in and live in this very small location, again, we live outside of the, I guess now, truck camper and not inside the truck camper, and so we still have realistically more space than I think a lot of people get. There's this idea of being trapped inside of the suburban lifestyle, right, where you go in and you have your mortgage and you have all your bills and your utilities and things like that, and you're kind of trapped in the life you've built for yourself, basically. And we get the freedom of being you know what, this weekend I don't want to live in Colorado. I want to drive down to Arizona, and then I can just run outside for 10 miles and go climb a mountain and then come back, and my house is right there. And that's my space. My space is I can just go outdoors and have the freedom there, rather than I don't need to find another room. I can just go outside.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you not have the, same arguments though? Hey, you're not picking up after yourself though?
I think one of the things about the tiny space is you realize very fast how dirty things get.
But you're not having the argument you're stealing all the covers, because really you're not having that much room to steal.
No, we have
Scoot
those normal
over.
things, of course, but I think they're exactly the same kinds of challenges you'd have in any sort of regular life. It's just I think we do have the distinct advantage of being able to be you know what, our setting's always changing, and I can always escape to the outdoors, and we have our bikes with us. I can go mountain biking, and I can do all of these things, all of these hobbies that are much more accessible to me because I don't have to go back to 6 Oak Street at the end of the day. I can spend more time just biking through the woods and then come right back to my house and to that other person just when I'm ready in that location, without wasting time just driving to and fro and things like that.
I think you are becoming the new Dr. Phil. I think you are.
My goal in life,
Because I just love it. I'm oh my gosh, maybe we should all move into a tiny house.
Everybody's moving into tiny houses for therapy.
Yes.
Literally, therapy.
I like
therapy.
it.
I like it. So, Liam, without a doubt, some folks in our audience are probably thinking, all right, I want to take at least the initial steps, and I'm interested in what Dr. Caven is talking about here. What's your advice for someone thinking about making the move to a tiny house, or the setup that you guys have today, or even the van life?
I think first step absolutely is research. We read up on this stuff for a year before we built the truck camper. And then obviously I had the experience of living in the van, and there was a lot of research going to the van beforehand. And then kind of figuring out there's so many options out there. It depends on what works for you. If you're a tinkerer, then get something old, save a whole bunch of money, and be okay with the fact that maybe you gotta fix your old 1980s Airstream or something like that. But that's only if you're a tinker. If you're somebody who doesn't want to spend the time working on things, spend the money, buy an outdoor van, buy something that's already made, and get a new reliable thing that's going to work for you that has a warranty, basically. It all depends. You're going to do the research, you're going to figure out this is what works for me and this is what doesn't. I think the big things that we looked at is we're all right, we want to, our priorities are, we want to be able to drive the whole thing off-road, find a trailhead in the middle of the woods somewhere. So we're all right, we need 4-wheel drive. And so we based it, or kind of tore it down that way, and said, all right, these are our options. We also knew that we needed a good size sleeping space. We needed the full kitchen, and we needed to be able to work out of it full time. And so that gave us, kind of cut down our list as well. But everybody's going to have their own list, and there's a lot of options out there, and it depends on how much money you want to spend and what your own abilities are. And kind of aside from that, I'd say it's not that scary. After you do it for the first couple weeks, it feels like a big step, but it's pretty easy. once you get used to it, just like you take the step and you're like, oh, like this is a good lifestyle that's like not that hard to wrap your head around. Like if you're a traveler, you already have the capacity to deal with a lot more of a like difficult life in mobility alone, and like how much you're kind of uprooting yourself on a regular basis. So like living in a camper or something like that is kind of a natural and I would argue easier step to make than to try to find housing everywhere you go.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think if I'm hearing you correctly, if people are thinking about it, do the research, take the plunge. It doesn't sound, it's not as scary as it might sound.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'd also recommend from a personal level, start out like a cheap kind of easy project that you can do and just make sure you like it first. I know there's a bunch of companies that are popping up as well that let you just like rent a camper van.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can just rent one of those and see if that works for you for a couple weeks, or do what we did. Like we bought the brand new truck because we wanted the warranty and everything like that and the reliability driving through the deserts. But we started out with a really, really cheap camper. Like our camper, all said and done, cost us $4,000 fully rebuilt.
Wow.
And like that's pretty cheap for a housing setup, you know, rather than dropping $60,000 on a new van and then be like, well, I hate this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Drop a couple thousand and build what you want. And then if you hate it, you just sell it. And if you love it, you're like, all right, we can upgrade, which is actually our next step.
Nice. That's great advice.
So what's next for you guys in the tiny house?
So right now, I forgot to mention, one of the disadvantages of our current setup is we don't have a lot of insulation. Despite having a heater and everything like that, it's cold in Colorado. Usually every morning right now it's like 17 degrees, and we have like canvas walls in the pop-up. And so we got rather cold, so we moved into an apartment in this last month or so. So we're working on our next camper, which is going to be a hard cider. That has a full shell and everything like that with much more insulation. And so our next step is moving into, or kind of having this shell built, rebuilding the interior to the way we want, and then moving into that as we drive up the West Coast.
Well, yes, I think that's probably an important thing. And I know that we've mentioned and you've talked about your partner in crime, Gabri. Can we say hi to her? Can she talk?
Say hi to her? Is that what you said? Yeah, sure, of course.
Hi, Gabri. I wanted to know, what's your perspective on this whole thing? Are you loving life, traveling along?
I am. It's been really awesome getting to move out here and kind of have a way to do it where I can still work remotely and still have an income while we're out here, which has been really nice.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, we really, really appreciate having you guys both on this podcast with us and being able to share your insight with our listeners. And Liam, just all of the feedback and just sharing your time with us. And before we wrap up, I really wanted to remind our listeners about your Instagram, which is @TimmyAndTheUglyCamper. But also at the end of our podcast, we do something, and it's really the heart of what we do here at Cardium, and it's giving the purpose of why we do what we do. And so I'm going to ask you, what's your why?
I think this is a question that I thought about quite a bit, and I honestly I struggle with a little bit because I think it has that air of like the job interview question, you know, like, oh, why do you want to work here? You know, and like everybody has to come up with a response and be like, oh, it's because I love the meaning behind the work or something like that, right? And I think if I really kind of just to speak from the heart with this kind of question is, why do we travel? Why do we work? Or why do I work as a physical therapist? Is like, I think first and foremost, to be perfectly honest, like we all have to work. You know, like we all have to make money at the end of the day. We got to support ourselves. Like that's kind of the world that we live in, and that's kind of your place in society, regardless of whether or not you like that. I do think no matter what, because you're in that position where you have to work, you might as well make it something that you can find adventure within, that you can still kind of find inspiration in. You're not going to be super bored with. I think that's the big problem with a lot of careers is monotony is kind of the death of fun in a certain way, and the death of excitement and finding value in your own life. And by traveling like this, by finding a career that kind of changes on a regular basis, we're able to create a career that's a net good for the world, pretty much. Because we have to do this kind of thing where we have to work regardless, might as well make it something that's meaningful and something that's going to add something to the world overall. And then, like, especially the travel part now, like, while we're young and like we can and we don't have the roots and things like that, we do it because it's exciting and because it makes us better people, and it adds a lot to us, which in turn I think adds a lot to the world, because if we can better ourselves, then we can kind of better our surroundings, better the world that we live in, better our outlook, etc.
Yeah. Probably one of my favorite answers.
Yeah, that's a great one. Well, Liam, thank you very much to you and Gabby for joining us today. Really appreciate the insight to tiny house living. And I know that we've pitched your Instagram handle. So hopefully you get a lot of new followers. You guys better be doing some adventurous stuff, because hopefully you get a lot of new followers after today's podcast.
Yeah,
and we look forward to
pictures.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing what adventures you guys are on. It'll be fun to see where you're at next year.
I'll be following.
Yeah, for sure. For
I'm
sure.
glad. We just use it because it's fun. So it's a nice, and plus, maybe we can live in someone's yard when we move to another state.
Okay.
Exactly.
My yard's
never
pretty
know.
big. My yard's pretty big. If
Sunny's offering her yard. There you go.
Oh, perfect. So, yeah, you just follow us, then we can direct message you, and it'll be perfect.
All right, it'll be awesome.
All right, very good. Well, thank you again, Liam, and good luck to you guys. That's going to wrap up today's podcast, folks. We'd love to hear from you, so please drop us a review. Let us know what your thoughts are on today's topic or anything else you'd like to discuss. And with that, we're out of here. See you later, Sunny.
See you later.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
You've been listening to Cardium from Aureus Medical with your hosts, Sunny and Matt. We're the podcast that gets to the heart of travel healthcare. To subscribe, access show notes, or to learn more, visit cardiumpodcast.com. CARDIUM podcast.com. Or wherever you're listening, be sure to rate us, review, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.